them.
Now let's bring in our guests. Alan Barron is a former special impeachment counsel to the House of Representatives. We will speak to him in Washington, D.C. shortly. But first, we're joined by Karen Greenberg, who's the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and she's joining us live from New York. Ms. Greenberg, very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. So 6 hours in, it's less of a debate, isn't it, than the members of the House of Representatives reading their statements. And from what we've heard so far, I mean, it's completely along partisan lines, as we were expected.
Yeah, it's very much around partisan lines, and it's very much the arguments that we expected to hear and that we've heard before. Basically, the Republicans are saying this is a sham process, that it's about disliking the president, that it's about reversing the election, and minimizing any talk about Ukraine. And when they do talk about Ukraine and Zelensky and the phone call, they basically rely on the he didn't actually do it, therefore there's nothing here for us to impeach him on in terms of abuse of power. The Democrats are sticking to the line of abuse of power, of talking sometimes in depth about what happened in Ukraine and interference with the election, or attempts to interfere with the election. And so it's been rather vitriolic, but as you said to start, it isn't really about a debate, an exchange of ideas. It's about repeated lines over and over. The one thing that's come out that I think is really interesting is that, in a way, if you listen to what the Republicans are saying, they keep saying this is about rejecting the last election. And basically what that means is let's wait for the next election. This is a wrong way to go about it. And because they're talking in those ways, they in many ways undermine the idea of impeachment at all. In other words, an election, somebody who's elected should stay in office until they're unelected or their term runs out or whatever it is. And that's something we really haven't discussed yet in terms of the takeaways from what we're hearing.
Well, let's bring in Alan Barron now. And Mr. Barron, you know, you're a former special impeachment counsel to the House of Representatives. Ms. Greenberg outlining the sort of arguments on both sides. I mean, what have you made of the arguments on both sides, and what Ms. Greenberg was saying about the Republicans not wanting to allow an impeachment to remove the president from office and leaving that to the will of the American people and the next election?
Well, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have offered anything terribly new that we haven't been hearing over the last month or so, as they've argued these same points back and forth. I think that the idea of letting the impeachment process sort of stagnate and let's just all wait for the vote in November, I don't think that's right. I think that the Constitution says we have the power. The House has the power to impeach. That is the sole power to impeach. It's there to be used if appropriate. I think saying, well, let's not do it for any reason, such as, well, the Senate won't convict him anyway, or, well, let's just wait until the election comes up. I don't find either of those rationales persuasive as a reason for not going ahead with impeachment, provided, of course, that the factual basis for engaging in the impeachment exists.
And again, given, you know, your background and you've worked on impeachments, how strong do you think the Democrats' case is?
I think it's very powerful. I think the Republicans have been nibbling around the edges, or they keep talking about process. Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do it that way? If you talk about what the facts show, I'm a former federal prosecutor. I would take this case into court before a jury any day of the week. I think it is a compelling case that the president held up the aid for Ukraine, and for a direct quid pro quo that's now become part of the American political dictionary, in return for getting the support that he wanted to try to undermine a potential political rival, Joe Biden. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And to To say, well, it's all process, it's all a problem with the way this has been handled politically, that is just ignoring the hard, cold facts.
Ms. Greenberg, do you think that that's what the Republicans are doing? Are they ignoring the cold, hard facts?
Well, what they're ignoring is they want to have it both ways. They keep saying the Democrats didn't provide evidence. They didn't provide documents. They didn't provide witnesses that would have allowed this to be, in their mind, a fair procedure. On the other hand, why weren't the evidence, the witnesses, the documents provided? Because the White House and Donald Trump blocked it. And so they want to have it both ways. The other thing that comes up a lot is the timing, how quick this has happened. And I think it's rather appropriate how quickly it's happened, given the political context, given the way in which the White House has tried to block so much of this coming to the fore. And I think they've done that pretty well.
It's interesting, isn't it, that that's one of the Republicans' main complaints is that, the process was too fast. And yet when they speak of the upcoming trial in the Senate that is most likely to take place when the House of Representatives votes to impeach the president, and they say, Republicans say they want a very quick trial. Mitch McConnell says they want a very quick trial. We just heard Lindsey Graham in the last few hours saying the same thing.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think they're talking out of both sides of their mouths in a way. They want it both ways. We'll see when it actually gets to the Senate. The reason they want it fast in the Senate is they think they know the results, which is that it'll be over, that it won't go forward in the Senate, that it'll divide along party lines at the very least, and that this will be a rapid dismissal of the charges. But you never know what's going to happen when you get into a courtroom.
And Mr. Barron, they are likely, though, aren't they, the Republicans, to get a quick trial, given that they do have the majority in the Senate. But again, as Ms. Greenberg says, we don't know what will happen when it comes to a trial.
Well, I think in this trial we have a pretty good idea what's going to happen, since you need a two-thirds vote of those sitting in order to convict. But that is why several times today I have been raising the possibility of the House voting articles of impeachment, but there's nothing in the Constitution that requires them to then deliver those articles of impeachment to the Senate. They can hold on to them. They can continue to investigate. They can subpoena witnesses. And if they don't have to rush to a trial, they can wait for the court process to proceed. And presumably, I think a congressional subpoena will be sustained by the courts. So I think that's a real alternative, knowing full well that if they go to, quote, trial, end quote, in the Senate, it'll be a quick trial and nothing to show for it.
But, Mr. Barron, do you think that they would have a stronger case if they waited, if they didn't send the articles of impeachment to the Senate, to a trial in the Senate immediately? And if so, I mean, why haven't we heard more about that option?
I don't know. Someone raised it with me, someone I can't disclose, but someone whose name you would recognize. And when I first heard it, I said, I have to think about that. And I slept on it overnight. And the next morning I called him up and I said, it's absolutely brilliant. Why rush to do something when you know you're going to go over the cliff and lose? I think it's really a very ingenious and perfectly appropriate and constitutional approach to this set of circumstances.
Ms. Greenberg, please do come in.
Yeah. I hear that, and I think I've seen it raised in a number of forums online, particularly today. But remember, this is about the next election. And the worries of the Democrats and of many in the country is that there are compromises going on with the next election. And the longer you delay this, the more time there is to interfere with the election, to set up ways of interfering with the election, to mess with disinformation. And so that's a game that I think that Democrats may not be willing to play. That's not a bet they want to make. I also think that Nancy Pelosi is not going to take that route. I think it can get very messy, very complicated, and very politically destabilizing, even beyond what we've had. And as we've seen, she tries to keep a very steady hand. I'm not sure she could do that if you open it up to that kind of process. So So, that's just another perspective on why maybe not go down that road.
Karen Greenberg in New York and Alan Barron in Washington, D.C. Thank you both for now. And you're watching us. Mr. Barron, thank you very much for your analysis. We do appreciate it, especially your expertise. That is Alan Barron. We're going to talk to another guest now. We're bringing in Karen Greenberg. She's the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and she's joining us live from New York. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera on this historic day. Thank you very much for staying with us. And we're looking at the vote on the second article of impeachment, that is obstruction of Congress. And interestingly, we've had a few, just one more, I think, Democrat voting against this article. I think we had 2 Democrats voting against the first article of abuse of power, but we've had 3 voting against impeaching the president for obstruction of Congress.
Yeah, I still think that this is a very strong win for Nancy Pelosi. Those numbers are very low. Again, we still have to wait for the second vote to be completed, as far as I can tell. But the president has already been impeached on 1 count, and he will be most likely impeached on this second count. And there are a number of takeaways from today and to how the run-up to this vote happened. The first is that we have a real divide in this country about what the powers of the president are and aren't, and what they should and shouldn't be. What we heard repeatedly today was something along the lines of, if the president did it, it's legal, much like President Nixon said, who was up for impeachment but then resigned. There's a real sense that a balance of powers is not something that the Republicans today wanted to embrace. And that goes to their embrace of a kind of presidential power that is not tethered. And so although this is a win for those who wanted impeachment, the nature of the debate, the values that were articulated, the questions that were and weren't raised are very troubling for how this country goes forward, whatever path they take in terms of bringing this to the Senate.
And Ms. Greenberg, just to update our viewers, it looks like the second article of impeachment on obstruction of Congress has also been passed. So 221 voting in favour of impeaching the president for obstruction of Congress, with 165 voting against. And as you were saying, it is a victory for the Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who was actually, unlike some who are more on the left of the Democratic Party, I mean, she was always reluctant to take on impeachment.
Yeah, I mean, Nancy Pelosi has kept a very even hand on this since the beginning utterances of impeachment. She was always of the mindset that she wasn't going to impeach unless there was actually something that the president did that she felt was impeachable. What pushed her over the line initially was bribery. Was this idea of a quid pro quo, that the president would get dirt, would withhold aid to Ukraine until Ukrainians agreed to investigate his opponent, his presidential candidate opponent, Joe Biden. And that was where she saw it as she had no choice. However, she has been remarkably shrill about this. She kept a very even hand, and she has worked with the members of her party. And you see the results of it here in terms of the coherence, the cohesiveness of the debate today, and also of the way they voted. So I think this is a real testament to her political skills.
But despite that, we have the Republicans saying that this is a political vendetta and that the Democrats have wanted to remove the president from office. I mean, the president himself will say that they've wanted to remove him from office before he was even there.
Yeah, and that's why the behavior of Nancy Pelosi is so incredibly important. She pushed back continually. She didn't want to impeach no matter who pushed her, no matter what they said. And she pushed back for, well over a year. And that is what makes it sort of undermines what the Republican line is, which is that it was just a vendetta. And I mean, the unwillingness to engage the behavior is striking if you compare it to prior impeachment hearings that have gone on. If you look at the Clinton impeachment, for example, or Nixon run-up to impeachment, what you see are people in the party saying, yes, this was wrong, but it doesn't rise to impeachment. You didn't see that today. You saw there's no there. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing chargeable. And that's actually different than what we heard even several weeks ago. So what the Republicans have done is dug their heels in, pushed aside a lot of the facts, and argued this as if it was a vendetta, which is very interesting because what this is about, as much as the actions of President Trump in the past and what he did, it's also about the upcoming election and making sure that this doesn't happen again and that there is a stop sign, a stoplight, some kind of penalty and punishment for this kind of behavior.
But what are the chances
which is basically foreign influence on a U.S. election.
Yes, but what are the chances of any kind of repercussions for the president, again, given that his party controls the Senate?
It's very unlikely that he's going to be convicted in the Senate. I don't know anybody who would, in their right mind, predict that. But this is an important moment. As I said at the very outset, this debate, if you listen to it, was about what the role of the president is under the Constitution and whether there is such a thing as balance of powers. Are you allowed to check the president in his exercise of powers? Impeaching him in the House is a check. It is a sign that this is not okay. Now, does that mean he has to be removed from office? No, let's take it one step at a time. But there is a vote to say no. There has to be a way in which we present evidence, we debate it, we talk about it, and we think about do we allow Congress to question the president? And if every time that comes up you say, well, that's not fair because he was elected, then what you're actually saying is the impeachment clause of the Constitution is null and void. And it's not. And that's one of the bothersome things about today was you are allowed to have the process. And it's important to have the process, and it's important to have it there, and that's why the Founding Fathers put it there, and that's why, no matter what happens going forward, this is a remarkably significant moment and gives Americans a chance to take a breath, to think about what's happened, and to think about how they want to go forward.
Ms. Greenberg, thank you very much for that. For now, that's Karen Greenberg. Well, let's take you live now to Battle Creek, Michigan impeachment. Let's bring our guest, Karen Greenberg, back. She is the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and she is joining us live from New York. So as we've had those historic votes in the House of Representatives, Ms. Greenberg, which is now adjourned, you have the U.S. president in Battle Creek, Michigan, saying that they shouldn't have even been allowed to have an impeachment because it was based on lies.
Uh-oh, I can't hear anything.
Ms. Greenberg, can you hear me?
I can now, yeah.
Yes, right. So as I was saying, the House has now adjourned, but the president is continuing to speak. He's addressing supporters at a rally in Battle Creek, Michigan, and he is he's in his element here amongst his supporters, and he was saying that, well, it doesn't even feel like he's being impeached.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. It's going to take him some time to absorb what's happened and to figure out what his next move will be. In addition to saying he didn't feel like he was impeached, he also said that he was disputing the facts and what they did and that there was a made-up dossier, really going back to the election itself, to the collection of evidence itself. And so I would guess that we're going to get a lot of different kind of things that he's going to dispute in terms of factual evidence. He didn't go near the Zelensky phone call. He didn't touch on that as far as I heard. He may do that later. But you can be sure that this is something that will eventually sink into the president, and his advisors will talk to him about what he should say and shouldn't say, because he will dispute the facts, and he may be successful in that in terms of affecting public opinion, which is why it's going to be very important to go forward with this. It's why this vote is extremely important, and we're going to see him in free fall for a little while, and I think this is the beginning of it, no matter whether that crowd likes it or not.
But will his free fall lead to his downfall, though? Because, again, the polls are divided, despite what we've heard in the impeachment proceedings, despite the evidence, the witnesses that the Democrats produced who said that, they heard the conversation between President Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, where President Trump asked the Ukrainian president, to investigate a political rival in exchange for hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid that was already put aside by the US Congress. And despite all of that, his supporters are steadfast.
Correct. And that is another stage, which is you're talking about, will he be removed? And he may not be removed, and that will, before the election, and then the election will take this forward. But there's a lot of things that aren't accounted for in what's going to happen next November when this country votes for who's going to be its next president. It's still, I think you need to reflect, we all need to reflect on this moment, impeachment, before we talk about this next stage, which is removal. Because impeachment in and of itself is a way of saying this behavior of establishing a quid pro quo that even the people you appointed attested to, taking an oath and attested to, is not okay. And this House has said it. And yes, the House is led by Democrats. And yes, there is a lot of partisan rancor on both sides. But there is also an issue of what is the president allowed to do? Is he constrained by the rule of law? And if he is, are there remedies that can take? And the first step in that remedy is impeachment. And that has now happened. And so I think before we talk about what happens next, what happens with removal, whether there's not election, this impeachment has happened. And part of what is very important here, in addition to whatever it means for Donald Trump himself, is what it means for the integrity of the next election.
Right.
Because what was going on here was a quid pro quo that was asking for interference with the next election. And that is something that can harm a country in ways that are unfathomable. And so that's the other part of what's so significant about what just happened tonight.
And what about the integrity of the Republican Party, who, of course, like everyone else, were expecting these votes in favor of impeachment? But do you think that now that it's happened, that they will take a moment, that they might take stock that their leader has been impeached, only the third U.S. president?
That's a question that it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. It looks like the Republican Party has become the Trump Party, that there is very little daylight between people who identify as Republicans and vote as Republicans and those who identify with Trump. And it's taken a very strong turn in a different direction than what we'd seen in the past from, let's say, the time of Eisenhower on. And so, look, the presidency in this country, in the United States, has been getting stronger and stronger over the course of the 21st century and a little bit before. But Bush assumed tremendous powers in the name of war after 9/11. Obama kept many of those powers, and Trump is exercising or trying to exercise a new level of power. And the rights it grants to a president and the rights it grants to the other branches to tether that presidency. And so this is a step forward for the Constitution working, at least at this moment in time. And it's hard to say what will happen in the future, but I think it's very important to accept what's happened here.
Ms. Greenberg, thank you so much for your analysis. Karen Greenberg, live in New York.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'm Elizabeth Perrin, another guest standing by, and that is Karen Greenberg. She's the director of the Centre on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and she is joining us live from New York. Ms. Greenberg, thank you very much for staying with us as we do this extended coverage of the impeachment of the US president. The House has now adjourned. What are you expecting when the House reconvenes and these articles are sent to the Senate?
That's a very good question. I mean, the first thing I think we have to think about is when are they going to do this? And there has been some discussion about delaying, transferring this to the Senate. Hopefully, they'll have some kind of discussion about it and make a decision very quickly. I'm hoping go forward and deliver this to the Senate. I really think that this is a moment upon which both Democrats and Republicans are going to have to take a little while to absorb what they've done. Jerry Nadler was very confident about what had happened and how important it was. Nancy Pelosi was very sober, as she'd been throughout, about the importance, the significance, and the sadness of this, quite frankly. But the question is, what does it mean? Does this stiffen the backbone of the Democrats to push this through quickly? Do they want to take a little while and think about what the next steps are, given that they know that the Republicans want this to happen very quickly and be done with it and be in the past? I think they're going to have to think very strongly about what they want this to say to the American people. Do they want it to say that there were crimes committed? Is there a way to take this vote and get beyond the partisan divide? Are there pieces of information that came out that were important enough to say, here we know there was wrongdoing? Because as Frank Bowman said, there was no admission on the part of the Republicans that there actually was wrongdoing. And that is a problem. And I think it's something that the Democrats are going to have to think about in terms of how they package this decision and how they decide what their next step will be going forward.
And despite the Republicans, denying that there was any wrongdoing whatsoever, in fact, they say that the wrongdoing has been against the US president, the duly elected president of the United States. We do have the Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said that he's actually not going to be impartial in a Senate trial. We've had, other senior Republican leaders like Lindsey Graham saying that they want a quick trial. So an admission that they're not going to be impartial, asking for a quick trial. I mean, how does all of that bode for the fairness of a trial for something as serious as impeachment, for abuse of power involving a foreign government and obstruction of Congress investigating the abuse of power?
Yeah, it's sort of like doubling down on what just got exposed and agreed on as a wrong. Delaying, doing this quickly, in the words of Lindsey Graham, that's one thing. But actually stating, as Mitch McConnell did, that he's going to just follow Donald Trump's playbook here and that he is not open-minded about this trial is yet another piece and something very consistent that we've been hearing from the Republican leadership for the most part, which is that we don't recognize impeachment as a process that we think we should have to go through. And again, this is an issue of balance of powers. To say we're not going to reflect on it, we're not going to look at it, we're going to double down on the fact that witnesses were excluded by the decree of the president, that documents were withheld by the decree of the White House. When you follow all of that up with, we're not going to sit back and have a fair trial and listen to whatever is presented, what you're essentially hearing is we don't recognize the impeachment process, we don't recognize the right of Congress to listen to the evidence. And that's yet another reason why this step is such an important step. And there are more people in the Senate than Mitch McConnell. And although he has a great deal of power about how things will proceed, there may be some appetite for listening. There may not be. But for the moment, we can at least look forward to that or hope for that.
Ms. Greenberg, thank you so much for your analysis. That is Karen Greenberg, live in New York. Well, Democrats and Republicans made their case for more than 8 hours about whether Donald Trump violated the Constitution. It paves the way for a trial in the Senate where a Republican majority is expected to block Trump's removal from office. Well, let's get more on this now. We're joined by Karen Greenberg, the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and she's joining us live from New York. Ms. Greenberg, thank you very much for staying with us on Al Jazeera. Ms. Greenberg, can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Ms. Greenberg, this is Elizabeth Puranam, the presenter in Doha. Just checking if you can hear me.
Okay.
I apologize, we don't have a connection with Karen Greenberg in New York. Let's go to see what the U.S. president is saying in Battle Creek, Michigan.
With Comey and these horrible people, what they've done to hurt people. I think one of the best things I did as president, a lot of people would say, you know, with all what we've done for the economy, but one of the best things is firing James Comey's ass out of there. Boy, those reports are coming. Did you see the other day? Well, first time now he's saying, in other words, he's 50% there, folks. He's hit the golden pond. Anyway, so what we're doing is we're doing things that are going to make our victory. And, you know, it's like a tree. We need that extra 4 years. We've done so much. Even right to try. You know, right to try? People were traveling. They're terminally ill. They're traveling all over the world.
That's the president in Battle Creek, Michigan. Let's try reconnecting with our guest, Karen Greenberg, the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law. Ms. Greenberg, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Good to have you with us. So, I want to ask you what you made of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She didn't seem to have an answer on when these articles of impeachment will be sent to the Senate for trial.
Yeah, I know. There's been some discussion today and maybe a little bit before today about whether or not it would be a good strategy to hold up on delivering these articles of impeachment to the Senate. This is a political, she's viewing it as what she said tonight was she wants to make sure it's going to be a fair process. That's a very high bar given the current partisan circumstances to have set. She may be buying herself time. She knows that the Senate has made it very clear, the Republicans in the Senate, that they want this to happen quickly. She may have determined that she has some leverage, that if she waits, there will be evidence, there will be witnesses perhaps, pending certain decisions by the courts. But she may just want to pause and think about what has happened. Remember, if she doesn't deliver them, then it's a kind of leverage that she has going forward about when she will deliver them. So I'm not sure which way she'll go. I think what she may do is listening to some of these legal scholars and legal experts who have put forward the idea that maybe it's a good idea to wait, and she's added on to wait until I'm assured a fair process, which may very much bringing more witnesses to bear than were present and available during the House hearings.
But that seems so unlikely, doesn't it, given that we've had the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying, you know, that there's no guarantee that witnesses will be allowed, that he's not going to be impartial in this process. We've also had Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a staunch Trump ally and a prominent Republican, saying that they just want this trial to be quick.
Right. And that's where you get the difference between the process and the judicial part of this process, the congressional part of this process, and the politics of it. And I agree with you. I think it's surprising, but we know Nancy Pelosi. She likes to think about things. She likes to do things in a deliberative fashion, and perhaps because this has become an argument that's suddenly out there in public and being embraced by some top legal scholars, that she may just want to think about it, steady her hand, and gather her sensibilities and her forces before she goes forward. But I agree with you. It would be a surprising move, given the trajectory, the momentum, and the importance of the momentum that we've seen to this point in time.
Ms. Greenberg, thank you so much for your analysis and for staying with us on Al Jazeera. That is Karen Greenberg in New York, as we have been covering this historic day in U.S. politics. Only the third president in U.S. history to be impeached. There he is, Donald Trump, speaking in Battle Creek, Michigan, saying that